I'm really excited about this next guest. And I was talking to my daughter yesterday about it, and I was saying that he comes from the Clinical Research Innovation Hub over at Microsoft. And she goes, "What? I had no idea that they had a hub like that." And my daughter, just so you know, I mean, she has grown up in clinical research and she hears it all the time. She's 24. She works at a doctor's office, but she has spent some time in research and she still didn't know. And I thought, I wonder how many people out there realize that this is something and this is part of Microsoft. So I'd like to welcome to the stage now Paul Slater. So Paul, come on up. And you are the co-founder and head of strategy over there at the Clinical Research Innovation Hub. So super excited to have you today. So yeah. So I know we had talked previously about the fact that kind of the same trend that we're seeing here about how the pandemic is really accelerating a lot of these enabling technologies. And we'll use that word enabling again, because it is a way to help move things forward, but it's not the overall solution. What do you think from your experience, especially, coming from your world, that how is this making really an impact? What do you see?
Yeah, I think what's really interesting is that if you take a pass all the way back through, I guess, the 1970s, the 1980s, there's a lot about clinical research that's shifted in that time, but there's a lot that has actually stayed the same. And that's despite wave upon wave of new forms of technology over that period of time. But I think what has really happened now at this point is that we've seen obviously advances in the way in which we think about research and the way in which we think about research should be done. But that's happened at the same time at which there's been a significant confluence of new technologies that really can enable those types of capabilities. So what I'm thinking here is basically things like high performance, scalable, flexible, globally available, compliant technologies across different regions, the ability to share data across the value chain, and the ability very specifically to be able to access diverse external sources of data in a way that was never really possible before. And so those types of changes are actually changes that have really only come about over the course of the last 5 to 10 years with the advent of technologies like cloud computing, common data platforms that underlie that are massively scalable, things like graph databases that allow us to connect, sort of manage and maintain the connections between data as well as data themselves, and technologies like blockchain, of course, that allow us to be able to maintain the provenance of data as it's being shared between different parties. So once you start to bring those kinds of technologies to bear, ironically, and maybe this is not the best thing to say in the midst of a pandemic, the pandemic kind of happened at the right time in the sense that the enabling technologies were there and available to us to allow us to be able to adapt and to shift almost midstream some of the approaches that we have.
Yeah, that's a good point. If this would have happened 5 years ago, I don't know what we would have done.
Well, we probably wouldn't be having a virtual conference to discuss it even, right? So, it's something that's worth thinking about.
Yeah, it's definitely one of those things that I don't know if we had luck on our side or something else, but yeah, it's a great point. So talking about that, when you look at that kind of range, right, of traditional to virtual trials, we've been trying to move the needle, trying to see where we can get to, what's possible, what's not possible with all of this new technology that is here and available. Where do you think we are on this continuum? Do you think we're in the middle somewhere? Are we ready to be all the way to the right a lot of the time? Or what's your thought on that?
Well, I think the key aspect for us, and actually really the main reason that Microsoft even got into this, is that this is actually something where an underlying platform that enables the continuum is the benefit that technology can bring. Because when you start to think about the nature of new technology designs, the nature of new technology architectures in general, the underlying principle behind all of them is, I would say, flexibility and adaptability. So we've started to realize that traditional methods of building software, traditional methods of actually even having software capabilities, they were always set around the idea of the fact that you'd look out 3 years, you'd look out 5 years, you'd look out 10 years, and you put a stake in the ground and you say, this is what I need from a technology perspective to meet the needs of 3 years and 5 years and 10 years down the line. And of course, business doesn't work like that. Life doesn't work like that. Everything changes. And obviously everything has changed dramatically for everybody over the course of the last few months. So the new wave of technology architectures are really centered around the idea of having flexibility in mind, which means effectively that they should be okay and effective at supporting that entire continuum that you're talking about. So it's our belief, based on the research that we've done in the field, that there will always be a space for things, I feel like, on the left side of the continuum and things on the right side of the continuum. If you think of the left side of the continuum being effectively fully interventional, traditional randomized controlled trials, and on the right-hand side of the spectrum being potentially fully observational and potentially even fully virtual. There will be mixes of those for the foreseeable future, and we will just basically not just potentially be in a situation where an individual trial is somewhere along that continuum, but potentially, as we've just seen, that you may start at one point on the continuum and you may shift to another point on the continuum. So therefore, you need some kind of platform capability that allows that to happen. And I think one thing that this should have taught people across all walks of life, is that unexpected things happen. And when unexpected things happen, then we need to be able to adjust and adapt. And by definition, we don't know what those unexpected things will be. So we shouldn't assume, particularly if we're putting into place trials that begin, let's be hopeful and let's say things are back to normal by the middle or end of next year. If we start a long-term trial at the end of next year, we shouldn't assume that for the duration of that trial, all conditions and all life will remain the same. There could be another pandemic. There could be another issue. There could be something else that causes us a major societal problem that we have to deal with in the course of these things. So creating and building flexibility into our architectures is going to be a very important part of what is necessary going forward. And that implies, at least for us, having these common, flexible, capable platforms that underpin the research that is being conducted.
Yeah. I think that's also an interesting piece too, because a lot of times we plan these multi-year studies, and there's so many things that could happen during that. I'm curious because there's now this emphasis on trying to find the right balance between what we actually have to do physically and what we can do like virtually, and we're really starting to look at our schedule of events and trying to figure out what can be done. What are your thoughts around that balance? And do you see something changing coming forward?
Yeah, I mean, I think that there will be a shifting mix. We will probably likely shift towards more virtual elements. I think what's particularly interesting about that, and if I can borrow an analogy from education right now, you can see similar trends that are happening in education. I, like many people, have a child that is being effectively sort of half homeschooled, half schooled through his educational institution, and all the elements of it are virtual, and it's, if you like, a collaboration between the parents and the teachers. And I was speaking recently to somebody who was governing educational policy here in Washington State, and what he was saying effectively was that this shift over towards virtual, for the teaching community in particular, has forced elements that previously were physical to be virtual. And when we go back, elements will go back. Elements will go back to being fully physical, but elements that we didn't think could work virtual are actually working better virtual than they were in the physical realm. So for me, what this is effectively an example of a learning opportunity where it doesn't mean that everything will shift over to be virtual, but it does mean that certain things that we thought couldn't really be effectively done in a virtual manner can be, or that there's clues as to what the right blend of physical and virtual will be. So we've seen, as you would expect, based on the fact that we have platforms like Teams that have virtual health and telemedicine scenarios, and then we've got omnichannel type capabilities that allow for patient journeys to shift from physical to virtual and all those kind of things. We're seeing a massive amount of interest in those capabilities. I think the thing that remains to be seen is that once it's not a necessity and it becomes a choice again, as to how much of that will shift back to the old world and how much of it will remain capable in the new world. And I think the real key to that will be this idea of, our organizations going to simply go on a trial by trial basis, creating an infrastructure for each trial that they create? Or are they going to say, no, this is actually a bet that we're making, a strategic bet that we're making, and so therefore we will enable all those virtual components across all of our trials, and then we'll choose to use them or not use them on a case-by-case basis.
I'm curious, do you think some of those decisions and choices are going to be based on the patient experience with it? Because you were talking about with the schools, that some of the things they're finding actually might work better than it did in the classroom when they do it virtually. But yet they still might go back to everything, normal. What do you think about when we're talking about clinical trials in this space and looking at what goes back, what continues, what moves forward, what becomes part of just the new way of working? Do you think that is going to touch into how it went with patient experience?
Yeah, I definitely do. And actually, I will say that, Clinical Research Innovation Hub, we've been around for a couple of years. We were an internal startup inside Microsoft, and now our work is being mainstreamed as a part of the core strategy of the business. And one of the benefits of sort of approaching this as, from the perspective of a startup was that we had an opportunity to be able to go in and, if you like, question everything, including what the patient experience was, what patient centricity meant to, for example, large pharmaceutical companies, what it means to patients themselves, what it means to patient representative groups, and how patient needs are being met. So one of our core principles, our core focus areas, is we refer to it as meeting patient needs as research modernizes. And that as research modernizes piece is actually very key. Because our observation as a company that tries to make software that delights people, is that when you really start to think about what a patient experience is, it's very contextual. So the patient experience in a traditional randomized clinical trial is not inherently worse than a decentralized trial. It is different. And so the role of an organization that's trying to be patient-centric is to make sure that regardless of where the trial fits on that spectrum, that the patient experience is optimized for that particular type of research. So if you're shifting from a world of what I would refer to as study-driven data generation to a world of data-driven evidence generation, if you're kind of shifting into that new world, then you have to make sure that the patient experience is optimal in that new world. And the key to that is that patient experiences, just like experiences with software, just like experiences with hardware, those experiences, we can collect them up in the aggregate, but they're actually very individualized. So for every patient, for example, that doesn't want to leave their home and get on a couple of buses in order to be able to get to a physical site, there may be another patient that actually doesn't want somebody to visit their home because they consider their home to be their safe space and they don't want a stranger coming into it. For every patient for whom the idea of having an Apple Watch or Alexa is exciting, is another patient for whom those technologies may prove intimidating. And so for us, the key is to use technology to first understand the nature of that patient experience and what is desirable and what is not desirable in the context of the study that is happening. And then two, use technology to enhance that experience and not make generalized assumptions as to what we think will be the optimal patient experience going forward. So technology can enable us not just in the case of providing those new technologies to patients, but it can help us to understand what that better patient experience is, from consent all the way through to the full completion of the trial.
Yeah, I think that was a great way to wrap up today, with the emphasis on the patient and the fact that we really need to consider them, and people who are in clinical trials are individuals, and they are going to have different wants and needs. So there is a huge challenge and opportunity for the industry to incorporate the flexibility and the individualized process in some form or fashion, which I think scares a lot of us because we're used to the very rugged and rigid plans of the past. And how do we create that without causing like more problems or bias or something else like that? But I think that's definitely an opportunity and where we're headed to the future. So thank you so much, Paul.
Thank you.
It's been great to have you here.